Today the committee is holding its first evidence session on the matter of the BBC World Service. The World Service provides news to radio, television and digital audiences around the world in 42 languages and is a key plank of the UK soft power. We've got two panels today of experts to give us context and to give us detail about the BBC's operations. So I'd like to thank you ever so much for coming in. We're so pleased to see you. Having read your bios and what it is that you've said, I think we have an extremely impressive panel in front of us and we would love to have your help. So could I just ask the panel first to introduce themselves to the public, starting on the left here.
Hello, my name is Jieun. I'm Professor of Korean Linguistics at the University of Oxford and Senior Research Fellow at Hertford College. Thank you. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Martin Scott. I'm a Professor of Media and Global Development at the University of East Anglia. I've done research on public diplomacy, the BBC, World Service and others. That's why I'm here.
Thank you. And Nick Westcott, I'm the Professor of Practice in Diplomacy at SOAS, University of London, former British diplomat.
Thank you ever so much. So we've got a lot of questions to get through and we'd like to direct our questions towards individuals, if that's all right. If you want to add anything, then please do indicate. But also, could I ask if it's possible to keep answers as concise as possible so that we can hear everything from everybody. And if you agree with what somebody else has said, then please just do feel at liberty just to say that you agree, not necessarily why you agree. So that it's nothing. There's no problem with if you not adding anything if it's not necessary. Just because we have so many questions, there's so much to get through, and we have such fantastic witnesses. So I think that let's just get on with them. So I wanted to ask, if it's all right, Dr. Westcott some questions about the concept of soft power, because I think that's probably a good place to start. And it's in the context of the impact of the BBC World Service on foreign policy. So how would you describe Britain's soft power strengths? And I think what's also important is how are they measured?
Thank you. Soft power is a rather amorphous concept.
Yes.
And therefore it's quite hard to sort of objectively measure it. But there are some commonly recognised components. And in relation to the UK specifically, I think there are three particular ones that constitute the sort of main bulk, if you like, of our soft power. The first is values, and that constitutes everything that the UK represents in terms of democracy, one that supports human rights, freedom of speech, rule of law. And that is, I think, actually quite important, but again, it's something simply from what we are. But it's also vulnerable if people see that we are not abiding by those values. Secondly is the education system, which is, if you like, more concrete in that it brings people here or it sends people out. But it is seen as an area of global excellence, and it's one through which there's a huge multiplier effect. People who've been to study here go back to their countries of origin and take with them an image of Britain. And the third, if you like, is what some people more classically think of as soft power, which is through culture, through the English language, the royal family, the arts and crafts and music and football, and that this what makes up what we think of as British culture, and that is very strong, but again, it's quite amorphous. So those are the three sort of key areas. But how does that create impact for Britain? It's through our reputation, through interest in what we do, and if you like, the power of attraction. People think, oh, Britain's a good place. I want to meet British people or visit Britain or find out more about it.
It's a very interesting answer, but it doesn't tell us how it's going to be measured.
There are various international measures,
yes,
which try to measure soft power. The Pew Research Institute, for example, in the US, does regular surveys of which are the most attractive countries. And then they use different criteria. So countries that are popular or regarded as a good place to live. These can be measured, and there are league tables, and you want to get yourself up the league table, either as a country to visit or a country that's respected, for example. And
I hope the weather has got nothing to do with it.
the weather, fortunately, plays a small part. But ease of access to a country plays a big part.
Yes.
So if it's quite hard to get to a country for whatever reason, hard to visit, that diminishes the attraction. The UK has scored pretty highly in quite a lot of these, but it has been sinking down the rankings lately.
Okay. And how can we convert the soft power from the World Service into something tangible? Tangible in terms of politics or diplomacy?
Specifically
or
on the
economic?
BBC World Service, that, if you like, constitutes a key part of soft power because it represents free speech, transparency, objectivity. It is respected because it is regarded as not pushing a British government line or a particular line, but being open to all. That's a core value, if you like, and its core advantage. Now, to convert that into, if you like, some form of hard power, soft power doesn't give you explicit influence in the world in terms of achieving, protecting Britain's national interests. There has to be a gearing mechanism, a conversion process. So, if you like, soft power creates fertile soil, but nothing will grow in that unless I've got farmers on the line. Farmers come and put something in and make it grow. And that's a political process.
Okay. So, I think I want to kind of keep pushing this about the soft power advantages of the World Service. So in what ways might the World Service enhance the soft power capabilities of the UK?
People have heard of it.
Yes.
BBC presenters are actually, you don't notice it so much here, but World Service presenters are global celebrities. Right. You go to Ghana, everybody has heard of Kumla Dumor, the late presenter on the World Service. He is a national hero. Okay. So there is a huge recognition that to work for the BBC is the dream of many people working in the media throughout the world, certainly in Africa where I've worked, and also to some extent Asia. So that's very direct. And it gives you access and reputation, and to deliver a speech or be reported on the BBC, again, gives you huge impact across the world because so many people listen to it. And they listen to it because of those values that I mentioned that it represented, and if the coverage is there. So it's not, if you like, an instrument to be manipulated to give you power. On the contrary, it's through not manipulating it that it has power, but the power is of opening doors, of recognition, and of representing what we like to think Britain is.
So the way that interviews are conducted on the BBC is a positive advantage?
Yes, there will be upsides and downsides.
I can imagine.
If on Hard Talk you are grilling another country's president, they might not like all the questions that you ask. But the listeners will think, we could never ask him that question at home. And thank goodness somebody's asked him. What does he say?
I mean, has it had an influence on decisions?
Who's it? It depends.
So, if you are the president, you're being grilled hard, and you're being asked to justify yourself.
Yes.
Have there been times when actually decisions have been changed, or
not? I can't think of any specific example, but a president or leader or a politician coming on knows they've got to have an answer.
Yes.
And either they avoid it, if they don't want to answer it. I'm not sure the last time Mr. Kagame was interviewed on the BBC, for example. But those who do, it may influence how they act because they know they will have to defend it.
Can I just ask this last question, which is about Hard Talk? Because I'm told that it's under threat. Is that right? I mean, in fact,
I have heard the same rumours.
Yes. I mean,
to ask the BBC itself.
But before we do ask the BBC, and I can assure you we will, would you like to give evidence about how important a programme like Hard Talk is?
Yes, it is very widely respected, very widely listened to, and the fact that it is direct and honest in its questioning is seen, I think, globally by most of the audience as a real advantage. There are a few cultures in which it would be considered not appropriate to ask a distinguished public figure embarrassing questions.
Yes.
So there can be some pushback if it is too firm. But that's a judgment on the presenter's side as to how hard to press. But to give one example, there was an interview with a man called Hemeti, General Hemeti, who is one of the warlords in Sudan. And he was grilled. He didn't reveal much, but it was very important that he was asked those questions and to hear what his answers were, even if we know he's lying. So it serves a global public service, if you like, that this exists in order to call people to account.
Yes, good. Thank you very much. Yes.
Can I just quickly follow up? The chair raised hard talk. I mean, I'm a fan of hard talk, but it's a little more, I think, than a rumour. So Stephen Sacker posted, today BBC News has announced plans to close BBC Hard Talk after 3 decades holding the world's politicians and power brokers to account. Now, I separately raised this with the BBC already, and they said, oh, well, it had very small audiences and it cost a lot. Now, it seems to me that actually those are not the measures by which the BBC should judge a programme. Actually, it was doing something which I doubt many other broadcasters do, which you have described, about asking hard questions in an impartial way of leading statesmen. And I just worry that the BBC is, as they are domestically, worried too much about audiences and cost and not about public service broadcasting. What would you say?
I would broadly agree with that. I think the BBC has to manage itself so that it continues to attract an audience, and therefore it needs to provide, so its coverage of the African Cup of Nations, for example, gets hundreds of thousands, millions of listeners, and is probably one of the most listened to things that it does, and it brings huge respect. Hard talk far less. But it needs to be able to do both, which means accepting that there will be some that are less popular programmes but serve a purpose in terms of the overall objective.
I probably ought to declare an interest. I've spoken to the BBC about this too, and I'm also a previous victim of hard talk, so I probably ought to declare that.
Yes, just to briefly, I guess the questions just reveal a contradiction in the question. So your questions were, yes, but how can we know it? How can we prove it? How can we leverage it? And how can we measure it? And if we follow that kind of rationale that we only fund. We push the BBC World Service and journalism, we support in that particular direction, it means we don't answer the hard talk very well. Well, if we follow the line of questioning, we only fund things that we can demonstrate, that we can measure, and that the graphs are going up, then we close hard talk. And so therefore the BBC World Service has to be funded on the basis of values. And so the value is that we appreciate what hard talk does, and regardless of the outcomes of hard talk, we are a country that believes in democracy and press freedom, and that's why we support it, regardless of its metrics alongside it. I just thought it was an interesting contribution.
No, very good, very good. Edward, did you have something?
I was just going to ask, because we've obviously focused on soft power, but the GRADE report for the FCDO on World Service from 2020, GRADE says that actually World Service doesn't just support soft power, it also supports trade and national security. And I was just wondering, actually, if you agree that it supports trade and national security, and if that is evidenceable in the way that we've talked about soft power.
I agree that it does, but it's fairly indirectly, so it doesn't land you specific contracts. But through this power of attraction, people say, I'm looking for a British company. Or they may hear about it on the BBC. There's a British company innovating in, for example, renewable technology. And because it's been reported on the BBC, they heard of it. They think we could use that here. So, yes, it definitely has value in the commercial world from that point of view. And on the security grounds, I think it's very important. I mean, one of the most valuable functions the World Service fulfills is providing news about areas which otherwise can't receive any news about it. I'm thinking particularly of Sudan at the moment. Sudanese population listen to the BBC because nobody else consistently provides reliable information. Both sides are busy pushing their case, propaganda, other international media take a side, and the BBC is assumed to be objective. That, if you like, plays a role in global security because it enables people to understand exactly what is going on there, including those who are actually on the ground.
I think Claire has questions which are pretty related to this. If I could just move on to Claire.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair. Absolutely. So thank you, Dr. Westcott. So expand on that point you were just making very well just there around Sudan. How important would you say the role of the World Service is in providing information during crisis and during conflict? And particularly, you're talking about Sudan there, but also with reference to Ukraine and Gaza. It would be useful to hear about any impact that you feel is particularly important of the World Service in such situations.
Yeah, I would regard it as very important, as I say, because increasingly we're in a world where there is a dearth of reliably objective information. And Ukraine, Gaza is very difficult to report on because nobody will regard your reporting as objective. Sudan, most people know nothing about it, hear nothing about it, but the BBC has consistently covered it through its East African service and its Arabic service, as one of the very few international agencies that has done so.
Thank you. And to follow on from that as well, do you believe that the government currently makes sufficient use of the World Service to reinforce British foreign policy goals in any given conflict, or could it do more?
I think it could liaise more. I'm not sure I want the government to do too much in relation to the World Service because it has to remain independent to retain its value. But I think they could, and British diplomats overseas listen incessantly to the World Service. It was my main source of information about what's going on at home as well as overseas. But I think there needs to be perhaps a more proactive dialogue between government ministers, the Foreign Office, Ministry of Defence, and the World Service, just to understand where each other is coming from and perhaps to pick up areas that actually the government would be helpful to get more information on. There used to be a BBC listening service. I honestly don't know whether it still exists, but it was invaluable at providing additional information, intelligence, if you like, but from open source. I think to some extent that's been absorbed by the internet. But open source information is very important. The BBC has very good access to that, and there is a real value to the government of sharing that kind of information. What are you hearing? I mean, overseas we always talk to BBC reporters as well as diplomats, because they often know more about what's as much. They have different sources to the ones we have. And therefore, locally, there was always actually very good contact, but maybe at headquarters there needs to be a bit more.
Just one final question on this, because there's some really interesting information about the different types of medium that have been used alongside the World Service. So using different social media platforms to complement the work that's done sort of via traditional channels through radio and so on, particularly in some of these conflicts, setting up TikTok channels and so on. I wondered if you'd heard sort of about the impact of that and the influence of that, and has that been successful, sort of integrating these more modern mediums as well, or is it something that's been tried but not been as impactful as perhaps had been hoped?
The BBC is active in using all these different social media. It's important that they do so, but it is not at the moment their most important channel. And because of the way many social media systems work, and others are more expert on this than me, it multiplies through outrage. Yeah. And the BBC is not into promoting stories that will provoke responses. On the contrary, it's trying to be objective. So it's very important that it's there and referring to it, but its broadcast information, its website, remain the core values. It would be wrong, I think, to divert too much into that, because it's a world where you're always going to lose. It's the trouble.
Thank you. I'm afraid that we've got a disrupted afternoon, and we're anticipating votes, I'm afraid, but we can just sort of soldier on, and then. But I want everyone in the committee to promise to go straight downstairs, straight back up again. Blair.
Thanks, Professor Scott. If I can develop an idea that Dr. Westcott introduced there, about what the government seeks to do through the World Service, both in terms of foreign policy objectives, soft power objectives. Is the government clear-minded enough in terms of what it wants to achieve, and does it expect the World Service to achieve things that it can't?
Yes, so really important question. So we've just published a book, myself, my co-authors Mel Bunce and Kate Wright, looking at other international public service broadcasters and what happens and how they have their editorial independence compromised. And one of the ways is through how the government does or does not clarify what its objectives for the broadcaster are. So in the case of soft powers, we've just heard soft power is a kind of vague term, and in currently BBC World Service is required to be a global ambassador for the UK, protect our values, aid understanding of the UK, and reflect the United Kingdom to the world, which are kind of vague, nice ideas that we could all agree with. But what's clear from our previous research is you could very easily reinterpret those particular vague values in ways that allow you to politicise the BBC World Service. So if you want to reflect the United Kingdom in a more politicised environment, I could say, well, why aren't you projecting the government's view? And so why aren't you interviewing more government ministers? And if you want to be a global ambassador for the UK, well, then you should be having a more positive view of the UK. And so there's plenty of examples where governments, less well-meaning governments, can reinterpret vague soft power ideas in ways that compromise editorial autonomy. So the first answer to your question is no. Soft power needs to be defined far more concretely to prevent future editorial compromise. And I realise that's hard to do. Well, I'm not even sure it is hard to do. I think the BBC World Service directly fulfills soft power because it embodies the political values that the UK supports. It supports media freedom and democracy. And so much so that the UK government, by virtue of funding the BBC World Service without editorial interference, is embodying and projecting the idea of media freedom. So if that's the definition of soft power, then you don't get into kind of fuzzy interpretable bits like this. And in relation to the second part of your question, if soft power can be if a vague idea of soft power can be reinterpreted very easily in unwell-meaning, very, very easily, then I think that your phrase of the last part of the question, as has come up a couple of times, is foreign policy agendas and foreign policy goals. Just as Nick was saying, that they shouldn't be in the same sentence.
With the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, what do you expect?
To answer, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee should want to pursue the national interest of the UK, which is supported by the promotion of soft power. And that's it, and that's it. But the moment you begin to instrumentalise specific foreign policy agendas, you inadvertently introduce incentives whereby it becomes easier to politicise broadcasting in future. And so if I know that you have strategic interests here, you don't like these kinds of disinformation, the government particularly has this particular agenda around this, and if you hold the purse strings, then you can very quickly, and there are many cases where it happens, you can very quickly inadvertently not just potentially compromise the editorial independence of the BBC, but just as importantly, compromise the perception of the editorial independence of the BBC. So the idea that the Foreign Affairs Select Committee explicitly asks, how can we, if we pay the BBC World Service more money, can we use it to pursue our foreign policy objectives? That sentence, that's my sentence, that's not your sentence, but that sentence could easily be reinterpreted and kind of weaponised against the BBC World Service to say that it's just another state broadcaster when it's not. So it's very, you've got to be super, super careful. And the same, sorry, I've gone on too long, but you get the point. Mm-hmm.
I think that's an important point, because about the idea of that sentence being put alongside the editorial controllers of Russia Today would talk about things in a similar way. So is it inevitable that increased government support for BBC World Service comes with that risk, or can it be avoided?
Yeah, great question. It definitely can be avoided, but there's lots of things to do. And at the heart of avoiding either reducing editorial independence, or reducing the risk that you are being seen to do that, is you must understand that editorial interference doesn't just look like someone ringing up a journalist and saying do or do not do that. If that's happening, it's already too late. Yeah. If a journalist is so compromised that a minister or a politician feels they can ring up a journalist and say do or do not do this, the game is up. What our research and plenty of other people's research shows is that early on. It's the working conditions of journalists that need to be secure in order to ensure that journalists don't feel aren't in a position where they are vulnerable to politicisation. So politicisation of international broadcasting can occur via imprecise definitions of soft power. It can occur via constraining your resources. So, I'll give you 1 more year, maybe 6 months, maybe another year. So if you've got a lack of job security, a politicised environment in which perhaps you're being criticised publicly by people, you've got unclear definitions of what is soft power, what am I supposed to be doing, and a kind of any indirect governance interference. If those 4 things combine, you've got journalists who will rapidly self-censor because they fear for their jobs, they're not sure what they should be doing, they haven't got governance support, and so to answer your question, you can definitely introduce lots of safeguards to support the editorial independence of the BBC World Service if it gets more money from government. But to do that requires multiple levels. And if you don't, short-term, long-term, explicit and implicit, and if you don't do that, then you could very easily be compromising the perception of editorial independence. So the two must go hand in hand. More funding must come with guarantees, not just a few nice words, but guarantees of editorial independence.
Leaving aside the independent sort of aspect of it and just looking at kind of effectiveness and going back to the idea of what it is that government expects the World Service to deliver that it perhaps can't. So I worry sometimes that we are in a kind of 20th century mindset with tackling, you mentioned disinformation, where it's two news organisations against each other, when actually the disinformation is seeking to do something completely different in terms of polarising societies and destabilising them. Are there things like that we are expecting the BBC World Service to do that we should actually be looking for other tools to achieve the outcome?
Perhaps, but I think there's a bigger context. The context of this discussion is that media freedom, by any measure, globally, is in massive, significant, protracted decline, and that any other similar broadcasters, supported by democracies around the world, like the BBC World Service, are also facing massive politicisation and budget cuts and constraints at the same time of rising authoritarian-backed competitors, the BBC World Service Trust, BBC World Service, and so it seems to me that I see your point. Yes, things have changed technologically, and so perhaps the BBC World Service needs to change in its delivery and be more digital first. And yeah, there's certainly a case for that, But that would be, I think, to miss the big picture here. The big picture is that the UK has the most well-respected, most impactful, historically trusted. It's like any other country. Any other country. I'm not here to be a voice for the BBC World Service, but it is undeniable that any other country would very much want to have the BBC World Service's impact, reputation, scope, and so it would be foolish for the UK, which continues to believe in media freedom and democracy in ways that many other parts of the world are struggling with. It would be ridiculous. So your question's a good one, but I think there's a bigger point. That's what I'm trying to say.
Thank you.
Good. There's another question from John.
Very quickly, Professor Scott, I completely recognise the risk that the perception of a World Service may be influenced if there is more government funding, and that could put at risk its independence. You talked about the needs to be safeguards. Do I therefore interpret it that the BBC's suggestion, which you'll be aware of, that actually the funding of the World Service should be wholly from a foreign office rather than the licence fee payer, you're not opposed to that completely, but it could only happen if there were very strong safeguards. And how could you ensure those safeguards?
Whatever the funding model of the BBC, there are big pros and cons to it. There's big cons to it being a BBC World Service being funded out of the licence fee, because the licence fee is funding for the BBC, and often the BBC World Service will always be second best there. And so that's a problem. That's what the BBC Director General believes. It shouldn't be funded by the BBC itself. There are a whole bunch of other problems with government funding for it. And so this is a kind of a massive balancing act, a judgment call to be made. The BBC used to be, before 2014, 2011, 2010, thank you, has always traditionally
government coming into
been
office.
Funded by, indeed, yeah, has always been funded by the UK government before it was funded by the licence fee. And so there is a historical record of that. And during that time, there were fluctuations, but the BBC World Service maintained its reputation. So I guess the answer to your question is yes. But I think we need to be even wiser about the safeguards, not just now, but in a small number of years' time, in which other people who might hold the reins to the BBC World Service might interpret its charter and its funding and the governance of it in different ways. So it's your job, not mine, to decide what the most appropriate funding model is. But if you're looking down, having the government giving more money, even maybe exclusive money, I don't think we should rule that out of hand. We should accept it alongside a massive, very clear set of safeguards. And the current ones that I guarantee I won't intervene editorially is just not sufficient as an out-of-date view of how you protect editorial independence.
Afra.
Thank you. Thank you to the three of you for being here. Dr. Westcott, I wanted to start just a couple of questions to you, because obviously as a former diplomat, from your time as an ambassador, how strategic and useful did you find the World Service to be in furthering the objectives of the Foreign Office?
Very useful and productive. As I was mentioning earlier, as a British diplomatic service, diplomats listen to it all the time and use it as a source of information, and we liaise locally with it in terms of the journalists who are there, and exchange ideas, exchange contacts, exchange information. So from that point of view, it's invaluable. In terms, secondly, of projecting the image of Britain, as I mentioned, through the values that the government has consistently supported, the BBC reflects the same values. And thirdly, it is visibly global. A lot of the presenters on the BBC World Service are from the countries that they're reporting to and about. And that's very important as well, because that to some extent also reflects a fact about Britain, but it also illustrates that the BBC itself is global. This is not British people talking about countries in Africa. Well, they may be British people, but my point is they're not they don't look like, if I may be explicit, old white colonialists. And that is a good thing, that the people can associate with the BBC because it looks and it sounds like them. And the language services very strongly reinforce that. The BBC's credibility in Iran is because most of the people speaking there, Farsi speakers, speaking Iranian, the regime don't like it, and therefore will accuse it of sort of representing subversive influences. But ordinary Iranians will listen to it if they possibly can, because they trust it and because it sounds like them, and to some extent it is them.
Could I add one thing about this? I think that's really important about this BBC World Service sort of giving the local language service, is because of course English is lingua franca, but often we kind of presume that everybody understands English and everybody should understand English. But in fact, the trust can be really earned when you when the locals hear their own language. And I think also the other thing that we sometimes forget is that not everybody can speak English, particularly in the global. There are so many people actually not understand the language. And if you're given just English news service, so many people who are in need will not be able to understand the news. So I think it's terribly important that we provide the service in local languages for those people. And perhaps this is something that UK could, very much unique role can play. BBC World Service can play to the wider population and the people who are in need.
Thank you.
Just a footnote. On some occasions, people might trust what the BBC says more than they would trust me as the ambassador, because I would be speaking with the voice of the British government.
Yeah.
And the assumption was the BBC would not necessarily be doing that.
I was really interested in your response earlier about kind of digital and, as you, I think, said, news spread through outrage. I mean, how do you see the World Service staying a widely consumed source of news on the ground, especially in places where you have been ambassador, when increasingly people are looking at different kind of formats for where they consume their information?
It's a very current issue in West Africa, where growing numbers of people, particularly the young people, those now with smartphones, get the bulk of their news not from radio broadcasts but from social media. And therefore it is very important to be present and to make sure you have a visible and attractive presence in social media, because that's where people are getting their news. And it's an area where some of those wishing to spread disinformation are even more active and even more effective, because they wish to provoke outrage. And we've seen that particularly in the Sahel, where anti-French sentiment has been very much spread by, I can't prove this, but it looks very much like they are being promoted by forces from outside the region. They're often through local influencers and the rest, but multiplied with the use of bots that are organised for them. And that has significantly affected public opinion and public perceptions of France in particular in that area. And the French have found it very difficult to counter that. So it is important that the BBC engage in this, but you have to do it in a way that preserves your reputation for objectivity.
Which is the challenge. Obviously, Professor Scott spoke very passionately about kind of ways of funding. I just wondered, Dr. Westcott, in your opinion, because you've spoken before about the World Service being overwhelmingly trusted, what, in your view, would be the most appropriate funding model to secure its survival whilst maintaining kind of trust on its impartiality?
The challenge there is to what extent can you commercialise its services? And the commercialisation also runs a risk of impinging on the objectivity. You could find a billionaire benefactor like Mr. Musk, who would give you a very large sum of money, but it might undermine your credibility without some constraints. And most people of that kind will want some return for it. Now, there is a challenge that if the BBC's World Service is funded by the British government, people will assume the British government is looking for some kind of return. So while this is a sensible source of funding because of the wider benefits to the UK, as Professor Scott was saying, it needs to be clear that it's a hands-off funding. Could you fund it? It does feed into the wider questions about funding of the BBC as a whole and licence fee. Certainly, I would argue that licence fee payers get significant benefit from some of that money going towards the World Service, even though they may not be listening to it themselves. But the growing number of British people live overseas. I think it's about 12 million now. They get some benefits of that. They don't from the home broadcasts.
Can I abuse my position as chair and ask you a follow-up question on, because you were talking about the Sahel and you were talking about misinformation and influencers being magnified by bots and the challenge for the French particularly and the undermining of their reputation and so on. Were there any examples of a sort of counterattack that you know of that has been successful that might be worth kind of looking at? Because I think it is a challenge internationally, and it's something I know that the committee is very interested in potentially doing in the future. But since you've raised it, are you able to give us any further details, or perhaps, if not today, and you have some ideas, we would certainly want to be following this up.
In that specific case, France 24, which sort of likes to emulate the BBC World Service,
yes,
has continued to try and put across a more, they see, objective French point of view, but it has been very hard to combat it. I'm trying to think of a case where the US has explicitly tried to combat that kind of misinformation. And it's quite hard to do without using the same tactics that are being used to promote it. In other words, flooding the market with information. And that requires somebody to pay, as Wagner did, yes, to set up a little factory that shoves all this stuff out. Yes. And if that is being done, it would not be something that should be done by the BBC.
Is there anything that you'd want to add to that? Any from the experience that you have in terms of attempts to spread misinformation in the way that's been outlined?
Excuse me, I can't give sort of more specific example, but the AI fake news is very much what we face each day, and in a way, I think the fact that the world is inundated with information. Perhaps before BBC World Service was more, its role is to give the information, but now I think it's protecting the information and give more reliable, because the BBC World Service has on the trustworthiness to the locals. I'm talking about stakeholders in Asia and Africa. So BBC became a name that they could trust, and also that could give them the locals the international perspective. So I think this is very important in a way to provide to them the trustworthy information. And this will be more important than ever, because we will be and even the social media right now, we don't know how that would also lead to an opinion one or the other. We need people, what they really need, the trustworthy broadcasters, and BBC Worldwide over the last the 50 years and so, the transition from colonial period to post-colonial period had a legacy and built the trust with the locals, and I think that nothing can replace. And this is the very important role that, in a way, the BBC, not the information per se, but bringing the people the information that they can trust. I think that is the real value of BBC World Service and the era of AI fake news, and where particularly in China and the world, there is almost so much fake misinformation, and there's who can fight against this misinformation, and it's not something that actually the people can trust that the BBC has on this name, and I think that's very important that we keep it and give BBC the right role to play in the region, particularly with our engagement with Asia and Africa.
Is there anything else, Ivory?
I know that we're going to come on to more questions on misinformation, so that's really useful. I just wanted to very quickly ask whether the panel we've obviously talked a lot about funding models, and there have been cuts to funding of language services, and I just wanted to understand what your observations have been, particularly on the ground, about what those kind of cuts might have been in terms of people's perceptions of the World Service in different regions.
Certainly in West Africa, I think Hausa was one that was cut, if I remember. The impact of the cut is far greater than the benefit of the savings. Not a huge audience to listen, but it's the only people who are broadcasting, apart from very local broadcasters. And being able, for the local company, because a lot of it is done through a sort of franchise system, the BBC's programmes are rebroadcast through local. For instance, having some Hausa service, for example, that they could then rebroadcast to the people. And this is a key constituency in relation to the strategic security of the Sahel, because these are people who are subject to the kind of social media influence and other influences from groups in the region. And without objective information being available to them, or indeed information about the wider world, there is no other source that they can find. So if you like, the impact exceeds, if you like, the relatively small savings of cutting these. Now, the listenership is not that great, we know. But I would argue the broader social and security benefits of sustaining some of these is very important.
Abdeslam was going to talk about disinformation, and I wonder perhaps if we go to you first, and then we'll go to Umar after that, if that's all right. Unless you've got questions on... Go on. Yeah.
Okay.
Go on.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, panel. On the cuts point specifically, yesterday we questioned the Permanent Undersecretary of the FCDO, and I asked him about his views on the cuts, in particular to BBC Arabic. We know last year that BBC have cut BBC Arabic, Persian and Hindi radio service, amongst others. I gave a stark example of in Lebanon, where we've cut the radio service that Russian-backed media has actually taken the same frequency. When we're talking about diplomacy and soft power, I'm really keen to know from your perspective, what is the effect on the ground to our diplomats, to our politics, to our government, to our stability and security of this spread of misinformation because of the cuts. And then, the head of the BBC just last month said that they're struggling to counter the rise in pure propaganda from countries like Russia and China because of cuts to the world service. What would, to this panel, what's your recommendation to us to put forward?
I think if we cut these language services that we have, I think, Britain, as we know that in London, Britain, UK is full of linguistic cultural diversity, which you're not able to capitalize much. But if we cut these languages, people will turn into the AI-generated news. That will cause us so much trouble to get back them on track. Whereas BBC, which are under trust, and people will be able to listen to their language, human voices, and the news that will give them information and would bring so much stability. But as soon as we cut those language services, and that means that all the legacy that we have built last 50 plus years will go, and then also people will turn into the AI-generated fake news. There will be nothing to stop, and because there's no foreign media that I can think about that can replace BBC World Service that could bring such trust from the locals. And I think also, in a way, I think UK, has a sort of responsibility, perhaps using BBC World Service to protect this the war, AI war, from fake-generated news. And BBC World Service could play a very new, important role in this area. But simply cutting these languages would just bring more AI-generated news. And the fact that those languages are very much minor languages, in a way that more easy for AI companies and the AI people to generate and use, bring the new wrong information. And it will be so difficult for us actually to rectify the situation. So I think if we give it up, then we'll leave it. And once we lose it, and we'll never get it back. And the loss or the misfortune we will experience later would be uncalculatable.
I agree with that. Geopolitics, like nature, abhors a vacuum. And therefore, if the BBC is not there, it will be filled by others who have a different motive in wishing to fill that vacuum. So the Permanent Secretary is better informed than me on the impact in Lebanon, but rather like the situation in Sudan, if there's not an objective source of information, people will grab whatever's available, and if it's disinformation, that will often exacerbate the situation.
Thank you.
So will you forgive me and let me bring Richard in, and then we'll definitely come to you.
Well, one other thing that the Permanent Secretary talked about was the cuts to international development funding, to the ODA budget. And of course, now that it's so limited, way less than 0.5% of GNI, do you think there are alternative sources of funding that we could look to for world language services besides ODA?
But my one thought would be to look for benevolent foundations who have an interest in providing. It's a less potentially prejudiced source than billionaires, but it's not necessarily. You go to the Open Society Foundation, for example, who promotes free speech, but it becomes a more complicated relationship, and there are people out there who don't regard the Open Society Foundation as objective at all, and that might therefore impact. So rather limited sources of funding. The BBC commercialises what it can. It does sell a lot of its products, particularly the drama stuff. And that's good. I think that's fine as a source of funding. But yeah, outside of government, there are options, but none of them are ideal.
Could I add one thing? Or no. Can I add?
No, please, yes.
I think it's sort of like perhaps one of the ways to make BBC Worldwide more sustainable is to broaden its partnership with the perhaps with BBC Worldwide Service, even if it's World Service. So, as you know, like more or less the cultural engagement or the ground of soft power in Britain is very much so with European partners. But I think if BBC World Service could kind of develop more partnership with Asia and Africa, again, like BBC World Service, because of the trust it has built, and I think there's sort of a lot of opportunities to build and use this service for the better engagement to really make soft power and cultural asset, a real asset for Britain. But I think that sort of engagement is less less obvious. So I think that may be something that has to be further developed to make it sustainable.
Very good. We're going to go and vote. Okay. When we come back, Abdusam is definitely going to ask for questions. And then we'll have John, and we want to try and finish by 1:15. Order. Order. The vote's finished. People are still coming back, but we're pressed for time, so we're going to move on. Thank you very much for your patience. Fortunately, it was only 2 votes. It can be worse. But Abdesam, I think you have some questions.
Thank you, Chair. My questions are to you, Dr. Keir. I think many of my colleagues have discussed a number of different issues in relation to misinformation, disinformation, and the dearth of objective news that we have, and what this means for the World Service. The particular angle that I'm interested in, I think you referred to this, was in relation to the East, China and Korea. What particular issues do you think this presents for the World Service, and how can we counter? I think we all know that issue is there. There's a problem there. What specific things can the World Service do in terms of maintaining the integrity and maintaining the need for objective news?
Thank you. I think, as you know, like AI-generated information is growing very fast in, the regions, and when you think about sort of AI technology in this region also is moving very fast. So I think it's important that we present information that the locals can trust. The one thing that BBC World Service can provide is the trust, and I think it's really important for the service to present the international perspective, but also the trustworthy information to the locals and the wider population. Not only Korea and China, the region, but also I want to kind of bring up one more thing about AI-related issue, which is that I've done a research last year about how the AI translation could work, and the thing was like, when it comes to languages between Western European languages and English, the AI, the large language model, is pretty accurate. But when it comes to languages probably less known, Asian languages and African languages, or these languages, just because the large language model doesn't have enough data, very easy to fake information. So in a way, the manipulation is much easier. So if you don't have the authority like BBC World Service to present the trustworthy information, it's very easy for the AI large language model could manipulate the information that could bring a lot of chaos. So I think it's at the peak of this AI sort of era, or AI information is more becoming the norm. It's terribly important for the region, and the linguistic diversity.
Do you think that governments have a stronger role to play? So do you think our government has got a stronger role to play in terms of countering misinformation, disinformation? Is there something more that we can do to challenge the level of input that governments, other external governments, foreign actors have in the way that media is presented now?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. And in fact, this is what I said about the trust. It's very much like important thing that you can never generate or make one a day. But for the last centuries, the BBC World Service has gained the trust of the locals, and so I think that actually is something that make it work. The people trust about BBC World Service. So even if they have so much information around, and also it's very easy for them to face this fake information. AI generated, simply speaking, in that part of the world, the news they face, the AI generated information and news is so much. But they need something that they can, trust. And BBC World Service has, gained that trust. And I think this is very important, and that we need to keep it. Yeah.
Can I ask a question of you, Dr. Scott, Professor Scott, and you perhaps might want to come in on the first question as well, just in relation to how the medium. I think my colleague mentioned earlier that the range of different sources that people get their media from now. Are we behind the times in terms of the BBC World Service and how we project the news? That people have moved on so far advanced now in just taking their media and their news from various sources, TikTok being the main sort of source of media for a range of different from a range of different areas. Has the World Service not really caught up in terms of how people take the news? And is it too late?
No, I don't think the BBC World Service is necessarily behind. I think it's aware, as all international broadcasters, as broadcasters in general, are aware of the kind of massive flux in the way people consume media. But there's a politics about how it chooses which platforms to engage with, because lots of the BBC World Service's audiences haven't are unable to or aren't online, and so and lots of parts of the world where the BBC World Service is very important, it's crucially important to keep providing radio. There's also a politics about whether you go on third-party providers, whether the BBC World Service puts all its content out on X or Twitter or YouTube, etc., and where there's a lot of disinformation, AI-generated material, where I think another way in which the BBC World Service is unique is that a lot of its audiences come to the BBC itself. So you might have the BBC app and you go and listen to the BBC World Service. So it controls its own delivery in a way that, because it is so big and well trusted and well used, it's big enough, it has enough critical mass so that people come to the BBC rather than being dependent and obviously to a degree, I'm sure it's still dependent on other providers as well. But if, as you keep saying, if you lose that, if the BBC World Service disappeared, then you couldn't bring it back. And so the idea that, so your questions are partly about AI and disinformation, the BBC World Service is big enough so that audiences come to it, and that's very rare because most audiences, I'm sweeping the world in my characterization, but it's trusted enough that audiences go to it rather than just logging into Blue Sky or Twitter or something and expecting your journalism to appear, and that's why it's so important.
But Professor Scott, surely you're making sweeping generalisations. You're making sweeping generalisations in terms of generations as well, aren't you? I mean, if you look at a younger generation, isn't there actually the big challenge is that?
But actually, if I can,
and the world is a young place.
Sort of, when you think about sort of Asian perspective, still like BBC World Service, I'm speaking from South Korean perspective. Sort of the news that has been dealt in BBC World Service, re-picked up by the local service and local media, and has been taken seriously. So I think it's something a kind of good sign. But perhaps if I kind of add one more thing about BBC World Service, the way how radio functions is very important. It's so crucial. But I think. Sometimes I also think it has to revolutionize the way how it is now. So in order to engage with the young people, English is lingua franca, which means that everyone, speaking English and engage globally in English. And BBC World Service could play a very important tool and format that also has some, objective function for those many people. I'm talking from very personal view. I worked in Korean and in a K-pop related tweets in 2021 or 7.8 billion, but they were all speaking English. And I'm thinking, why can't they do that in BBC World Service? So, more reliable. So I think some more effort has to be made in order to revolutionize and to make it more culturally attractive to the people, not only the UK citizens, but global people who are using English. So I think it has some, the other side, keep the tradition but revolutionize so that it can be an engaging format for many people.
Got Blair wanted to come in and then Uma.
So responsive, there in terms of disinformation, we're focusing on BBC World Service's role as informing people. Could I ask a question about the role of educating people? So one of the attractive things about the kind of simple and kind of polarising narratives of disinformation is that they make people feel smart because they're not complex. And I wonder whether you feel that the World Service is doing enough to make people feel confident and comfortable as they digest the different forms of information that are there now in terms of educating people to recognise what disinformation looks like and to feel comfortable with complexity.
I think probably also it depends on which, maybe have a diverse perspective. But when I think about my expertise, I think it has the right tone to reach out to the people who need to hear it. But perhaps I think it has to have some edge to include some of the young people, young generation. It could bring very neutral information that's also very important. But perhaps it can have some of the information that could attract young people as well. So I think it has to same format, but has some more, update or the radical update. In that case, if it happens that BBC World Service has great potential for the place where people can communicate, and actually, really, when you talk about soft power, the Britain's real soft power can really flourish. I think using BBC World Service. And when you think about again, misinformation, it's. probably could be, when you haven't asked this question about the AI translation, but one of the ways to fund cut funding for BBC World Service is to use AI-related, translation. But as I said, like if you use many of the languages that perhaps we register as marginal language or like endangered languages, large language model can easily manipulate and can lead you to different places, but can miss information. But in a way, BBC World Service could kind of play an anchor that people can reference back. This is what it says, and then they can compare. And there will be reference point for so many people who are in need.
Yeah, go on, Uma.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dr. Keir. I have a specific question related to your viewpoints here. Colleagues will be surprised to know that I've actually appeared on a BBC World Service myself at the BBC.
Really?
BBC
What language are you speaking?
It's a running joke here. But I've been on BBC Tamil, and I absolutely identify with and understand the point you made here about the trust and authenticity when it's your own language media. Now, they did subtitle me and caption me, but that's a thing for another time. You talked about misinformation and disinformation. What I found really interesting is that this clip of me speaking to BBC Tamil was shared through South India, through northern Sri Lanka and Jaffna, and then picked up by the state media in Sri Lanka as well, and translated into another language, into Sinhalese, and then shared through the WhatsApps, and eventually made it over to my own family WhatsApp. And actually, the trust and pride that friends and family saw when they'd seen me on BBC World Service was unlike nothing else since my election, which is quite something, right? And the point you made here about the misinformation spread, WhatsApp seems to be one of the key ways misinformation is spreading. But actually, the example I've given you of where a BBC clip has also been shared on WhatsApp was really interesting to see how we can share BBC World Service and our culture, our values, our soft power of, first person of a certain heritage, Tamil heritage in my case, elected in Britain. And it kind of encapsulated all of that. So part of this is looking at the modernisation and looking at AI. Should the BBC modernise to be fit for the purpose, and using World Service on things like WhatsApp, different channels, Blue Sky, Twitter, TikTok, all of these things.
Yes. I think you should also demonstrate how BBC or UK in general values this multilingual, multicultural nature of this nation. There's 300 languages spoken in London only, most diverse city in the entire world. But I don't know how much linguistic cultural diversity is celebrated in our media or in our outset. And I think the BBC World Service actually is very much token of how this is celebrated. And if we close it down and or somehow make it only like AI sort of voices to say, like in China or in so many places, as you may know, the avatar is speaking, giving the news. As soon as we lose the human touch, also we lose the trust. And if we lose the trust, and it's I think a nationally UK's commitment to bring this linguistic cultural diversity, using it as our real asset to boost up our soft power. I think we will lose that aim. And it's the BBC World Service, the way how we represent linguistic cultural diversity of the marginal languages or Asia, Africa. That's very much a big statement as a nation, that how we care for the diversity we have, and that will speak so much to our own nation, but also globally to who are engaged in English language. Yeah.
I think we're coming to the end, so perhaps I could just ask a sort of wrap-up question of you, which is that the World Service has obviously suffered cuts to its budget. There have been questions sometimes about its impartiality in certain areas, and its global reach has fallen quite considerably in the last few years. So do you think that trust in the BBC World Service and its reputation and its influence are as great as ever, or is it now in decline? Go. Dr. Westcott, go for it.
Who's brave?
The last few years have been quite rough for this country in a number of ways, and the BBC World Service has to some extent reflected that, the BBC as a whole. There have been controversies that have penetrated to the global perception, both of Britain and the BBC. So I think there has been a shrinkage, if you like, of its global impact, but from a very large footprint, and still, as has been said, I think an envied one by others around the world. And it is therefore not an irremediable issue, but it does need a demonstrable investment that this is something the country cares about and wishes to sustain.
It's a money question.
It's a money and resources, but reputationally, I think that has survived sufficiently intact for it to provide a solid foundation that, given the necessary resources, it can re-establish itself. And I would argue, in Britain's national interest, it's more than ever important that it does that the way the world is going, which is a bigger issue.
Would the others agree?
You go next.
Maybe this is not totally related to your question, but I think it's sort of like a BBC World Service. It's a wonderful service, but I think the great thing is that it has a trust with sort of our Asian and African stakeholders. But I think the way how BBC World operates right now, more effort can be made. It may not be just BBC World Service, but Britain as a whole, in terms of engaging and making, having more strategic partner in the time of Brexit, post-Brexit, going beyond, and to have, Asian and African engagement, cultural exchanges. I think the same thing is happening that side of the world, looking for the different, alternative strategic partner. So I think it's something, the time we can kind of, perhaps BBC World Service would be a good opportunity or a good, medium for us to engage, but it's something that I think is the time to go beyond Europe and to engage and, to make most of our, diversity we have.
I'll just be brief. So I think while BBC World Service has faced cuts, and so perhaps there's been a slight decline in its reach and influence, during that time, the global media environments have declined significantly. So relatively, it has become more important. I think that's the best way to characterise it. But I guess my final point would be that you can't treat the BBC World Service like other things that you would fund. The BBC World Service is journalism. Journalism, unlike building buildings or funding education or schooling or other things, journalism is a profession shaped by professional norms that are easily challenged, even via the perception and even indirectly. So you can't treat the Foreign Office, British government support for journalism in the same way as other things. When you cut it, it's not just having less of it. It's undermining the trust, it's undermining the long-term capacity, the institutional memory, the kind of working conditions of the people who haven't lost their jobs. Should they go and look elsewhere because maybe they lose their job next? So journalism is as a thing that you fund has different dynamics to it, and is just much more precarious.
Well, thank you on that note. Great. It's been so nice of you to come in. We have learnt so much from the three of you. Thank you so much for giving us your time. We have rushed, and I'm sorry about that. And if there's anything that you think that we should have heard, perhaps when you're on the way home tonight, I wish I'd said that, please do write. And indeed, when we're writing it up, if there's anything that we need to clarify with you, may we get in touch. But thank you again. So much for your time. We really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I wonder if we might go to the second committee, second panel, if they're here. Yes, they are. Good.
And we're still live.
And we're still live, yeah. We're live, do not swear. Thank you both very much for coming, and I'm sorry that we're late. I know the Baroness will know what it's like when we have to vote and all rush off. But we're trying our best to try and keep you to time, to keep ourselves to time. I do also know that you need to leave at 4:15, Baroness, so we may be So then we've got some questions at the end for Jamie on his own, when we have him on his own. Would you mind introducing yourselves, please, formally?
I am Baroness Helic. I am a member of the House of Lords, Conservative. I am a massive admirer of BBC World Service, so I have to put that on the table to start with. And I was a special advisor to William Hague when he was a Foreign Secretary between 2010 2014 until 2015 actually, and prior to that I was with him as he was a Shadow Foreign Secretary in preparation to take one of the grandest and one of the best offices in government.
Hello, I'm Jamie Angus, and for the purposes of this I was the Director of the World Service from 2017 to 2021. And I'm currently a news executive working in North America and the Gulf, including in the UAE and Saudi Arabia.
Very good. I'm going to kick off with a few questions to begin with, if that's all right. And can I ask first one to Mr. Angus? What are the financial needs of the World Service in the coming years, and is there likely to be any damage in the short term if funds aren't forthcoming?
In a way, it depends what the mission is, and I think one of the reasons that this inquiry is incredibly welcome is that as we head towards a new charter period and for the second half of this decade, I think it's useful to set out what is the mission and strategic objectives of the World Service, and therefore what is needed to fund it. It's currently the case that in the recent budget the government increased its funding for the World Service. Very, very welcome, of course, that it did so. But that goes alongside a series of cuts that have happened on the BBC side. So the overall size of the pot, as far as I can make out, has not necessarily increased while the kind of demands and costs have continued to do so. I think in my written evidence, and you've probably heard this from others, I put some indicative numbers about what other mature, influential Western democracies are spending on their international news broadcasting. I think we're kind of at or thereabouts with the French France Média Monde and Deutsche Welle, but if you look at what the Americans spend on VOA, the US AGM family of content, that is a significant amount larger than what is spent on the World Service. So I think depending on how the mission is set out for the rest of the decade, there should be room for the funding to increase, both for the actual journalism activities that journalists doing on the ground, but also for the distribution, the technology, the way people get their news that was referenced really interestingly in the previous panel. All of this should be redefined and the resources set out for that.
And do you think that the recent budget allocation to the World Service shows that the BBC's arguments for increased funding has been successful? Do you think that? And do you think that it's? I mean, what do you think of the arguments that it should be that increase should come from the Foreign Office?
Well, I think it's good news. It would be churlish not to say that it was good news. But as I referenced in my previous answer, I think it's broadly only made up a gap in funding where the BBC side had fallen, because in the second half of this charter, as the committee will be familiar, the BBC no longer seeks to ring-fence £254 million a year spending on the World Service. And the other point about this in-year or year-by-year funding settlements to the World Service, when I was director, I was lucky enough to be in the final years of what was then the World Service 2020 agreement, which was the expansion between 2016 and 2020, and the addition of additional language services, 11 new language services. And so for that period, the World Service had a consistent funding plan that allowed us to invest and have confidence over a 5-year funding period. Since 2020, that has not been the case, and there has been a series of kind of in-year or ad hoc agreements made between the government and the BBC, and that is not a good climate to invest in the very long-term thing. We talked a bit about disinformation, we need to talk about AI, we need to talk about digital distribution, digital product. All of these things require longer-term, stable funding plan, and I think the spending, the CSR that's coming, the new charter review, a sense of setting that out for the rest of this decade would be, it's not even the amount so much as the ability to plan to invest.
Is there something about I mean, I hear what you say about what happened up to 2020, but then since then there seems to be almost a feeling that there's a sort of decline going on. There's maybe a managed decline, maybe even worse than that actually. That it's almost like a kind of orphan child, with BBC saying, well, we don't want responsibility for it, or the Foreign Office going, well, we don't want responsibility for it. I mean, is that fair?
Well, I said in my written evidence that the World Service is never the BBC's biggest problem and never the government's biggest problem.
Yes.
And I think there's something in that. And I spent a large part of my time as director, as Sir John will remember as he helped with this, but going round Whitehall and government departments saying, hey, look, there is a real crisis coming over here. This is specifically around the funding of BBC World News, and saying you might wake up one morning and BBC World News, as you know it, won't be there anymore. And I'm sorry to say that is exactly what's happened. We now no longer have a dedicated international news channel. But because that's never the biggest problem either for the FCDO in that case or for the BBC, and despite the best efforts in good faith of everyone involved, it is hard to reach that kind of longer term funding. And I think the tail off that Sir John mentioned, the tail off in the global audience reach figure, for example, these are the kinds of impacts that we're going to see more of if a longer term funding settlement is not reached.
Is there anything you want to add, Baroness Helic?
Yes, I would just like to say that this was a positive action that was taken by the new government to give some reassurance to BBC World Service. But I just wonder, positive blips that you kind of occasionally experience cannot provide long-term security and long-term planning, and negative stresses in the same way undermined confidence of the people who work for BBC World Service. And considering just how important it is, and it is so difficult to imagine when you live in democracy that news is not a luxury. It's the most precious thing in terms of insecurity, instability, in countries where there is a level of corruption, where you can't get the right content and you can't read the right news, or news has been manipulated very often. It is absolutely irreplaceable as a commodity which we can provide, not because we have to, but because we can. And it's in our gift to share news. And living in the age, I remember in 2010, foreign policy and foreign affairs was kind of like not a regular occurrence. You could actually plan what you wanted to do, and there were surprises, obviously, Arab Spring, etc. But you could sort of find yourself in a situation where you would know exactly where you want to head to. You know who your friends and your adversaries were. And then right now we live in an era where you can basically write a speech on Monday, and by Friday you have to tweak it and you have to change it because they have been. Now just imagine in the era where that development is interpreted, whether intentionally or unintentionally, in a way that suits a particular narrative. You do rely on kind of a traditional source of news like BBC World Service. And I was born in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and during the war in the 1990s, BBC World Service was like a source of information for me. Having something that kind of really gives you the right, this is what happened, this is who arrived, this is who's trying to help, this is the diplomatic effort to achieve ceasefire. It's absolutely invaluable, and we can't feel it here. We kind of think, and often I come across people who say to me, well, you love BBC World Service, but why would we be paying for someone to have it, service in their language? And to me, it's like, why would I be paying for MOD to protect this country? It's the cheapest and the best way of protecting the interests of this country and of our allies, because you're able to put out what is truthful, and you're able to push back against propaganda, disinformation, and misinformation.
You talk about blips and the difficulty with a blip of money, and I thought perhaps I ought to ask Mr. Angus what he hoped from the spending review in 2025. Now is your moment.
Well, I think, as I say, the comparative to what, say, the Chinese state and the Russian state, or even the Qataris and the Al Jazeera are spending on international broadcasting, we are below where we would want to be. But I want to be realistic, which is that, even from abroad, looking at the public spending pressures in the UK, it's probably not realistic to be asking for the additional hundreds of millions of pounds, which could be well spent and would provide good value. So I think it's a question of, for the CSR, can the CSR mechanism unlock at least a sort of 3 to 5 year funding span that, alongside Charter Review, would provide some clarity both about what the BBC puts in and what HMG puts in, and is relatively clear about how that would last, certainly over a span of 3 years. There are really, really good cases for new investment around additional language services, new investment around digital distribution in particular, and the digital transformation of the World Service. These are all really, really important priorities, and feels like the CSR would be the time where some of that would be settled.
I think Edward's got some questions that are related to that.
Well, I suppose, yes, CSR, but there's also the Charter Review coming up as well, and I guess that theoretically is another opportunity to look at a long-term model. So what is the ask for the Charter Review?
Well, when you see Tim and others, you can ask what their actual ask is. I think I'd put in my written submission, a suggestion where the BBC would remain responsible for international output in English, and the government would take on the funding of all the language services. And I think broadly that is a kind of elegant and sensible solution, because it retains the licence fee payer has a strong connection to services in English, because it's a bit of a generalisation, but this is a language that everyone in the country can understand. They can receive and consume those services. And it reflects the great complexity of the provision of language services, and how that fits more explicitly into the UK's international soft power project and its national security infrastructure. So I think I suggested in the written evidence that the language services would be funded by HMG, and that the oversight for them could be passed to the Cabinet Office rather than the FCDO, and that Parliament itself might have a role in a kind of parliamentary grand committee in overseeing the work of the World Service, which would represent the extraordinarily deep and bipartisan support for the World Service in this institution that we're sitting in today. And that reflects much more the way that international broadcasting is organised both in the United States and in Germany, for example, both Deutsche Welle and the VOA, the US AGM American services, are funded and overseen through the Parliament. This is, the UK doesn't work in that way, and maybe it's a fantasy and can't happen. But that would be my suggestion, because I think it would reflect the deep support for the World Service in this institution. In fact.
Well, I think you're getting that with our committee doing an inquiry, with the Culture Committee doing an inquiry, and we think the Overseas Development Funds are intending to, and then for there to be a joint hearing of the three committees. So we are doing our bit, but we're not necessarily without questions.
Very briefly, and one of the issues is obviously that Charter Review and the CSR don't quite align, and so this is why precisely this kind of big picture thinking is really welcome, because it allows a government and the BBC leadership to kind of plan for those two things to come together.
Obviously, a lot of this comes back round and round to money, and you've referenced where we sit sort of on global league tables, below the Qataris, on par with France, pretty much half what the Americans are spending. But then you look at Russia today at 1.5 billion, you see China somewhere in excess of 5 billion in terms of what they're spending on pushing out their messaging and their worldview. And I'm just wondering whether or not are we in the game? Do we compete? There is such a huge discrepancy in terms of that budget.
I mean, I think every pound that we spent has additional leverage because of the brand, if you like. We've heard a lot about the trust relationship with the World Service, that any investment has an outsized return because there's already a propensity amongst the audience to kind of trust and engage with what's being provided. But I think your point about China and Russia is relevant and important because they are not just investing in journalists on the ground, what you and I would think of as the day-to-day journalism. They are investing very heavily in technical infrastructure, particularly in African markets, but also in Asia. You know, they are entering those markets and offering assistance around radio distribution, television distribution, digital development, and those are almost bottomless. You know, you can spend a very, very significant amount of money on those kinds of initiatives. But these are the kinds of things that the World Service should be thinking about. It should be thinking about how do transformational new technologies like AI, like free internet from satellites, you know, these are the kind of big and significant capital investments that an organisation like the World Service should be making the case to make. And the Russians and the Chinese are certainly ahead of us in that respect.
I'm going to go to Blair, and then, if it's all right, Claire, I'm going to just bring in some questions about Arabic service and then come to you afterwards.
I think you were here earlier when Professor Scott was talking about the very fine line between us even just writing down that the BBC World Service should be an instrument of foreign policy and the sort of editorial values of the other broadcasters you've just listed. I'm interested in your perspective on how to ensure that that idea that underpins the brand that you're talking about is protected, and does the difference between, you know, the funding coming from the BBC and the funding coming from government make that more difficult in practice for you?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and there is no question that the greater amount of money that the state directly puts into the World Service, the easier it is for our country's enemies to argue that, oh, well, you know, it's just like Russia today, but British, right? And I'm very alive to that argument. There are really good answers to that, which are the protections that the BBC Charter and BBC editorial independence offer, and how you can assure and verify that. But I do understand the argument. I mean, I suppose what I would say in the end is that it doesn't really matter. You know, people who wish the UK ill will make exactly those arguments anyway through disinformation in whatever way that the World Service has funded, and they made those arguments even when the BBC had sole responsibility for the funding of the World Service between 2014 and 2016. So in a sense, I think it doesn't quite matter what we do. You know, people who wish the UK ill will say what they want anyway, and I think the relevant question is, can we come up with a structure that continues to guarantee that editorial independence, which the previous witness, I thought, spoke really engagingly about.
Do you have anything to add, Baroness Helic?
Well, I think it's important to preserve that image of independent reporting, and I think BBC has done pretty well. But you can, if you follow, I happen to follow both Russia Today and Sputnik, and majority of these, and how they have interfered and influenced understanding of world events, for example, in the Western Balkans. There is undoubtedly a particular trust that is attached to BBC and BBC World Service. It's a service that goes back for you know, I wouldn't say hundreds of years, but tens, you know, for 70, 80 years. And that brand, it's really, really strong. It is, however, obviously important that it's not portrayed as a government tool. And I would agree with Jamie, those who wish to believe that, there's nothing you can do to persuade them that it's not the case. But the best way of countering that narrative is through balanced and independent reporting. And that is something that you cannot achieve if you watch, for example, if you do Russia Today, or if you hear Pravda that has launched in Western Balkans. I actually went on their webpage today before I came here. You just wouldn't believe what the world looks like when you read Pravda Serbia, because it says that Ukrainians have lost 900,000 soldiers. It says that 5 missiles that have been launched today have been destroyed. It says that Russian women and children are being attacked and violating the most. When you read that somewhere where you don't have balanced reporting, you actually will be pretty soon after 4 or 5 times you visit that website, which also has some other stuff like celebrity and it's got sort of football, etc., you will start slowly building that. And the speed by which, for example, Pravda was launched in the Western Balkans and how quickly it managed to get followers is quite astonishing, but there are still skeptics who will go and double check and see what is it that BBC is saying. So I think there is a brand that needs to be protected, but there is a lot that needs to be done for that to happen, and BBC needs to be constantly present and safe and secure in order to deliver that.
Uma, do you want to ask about BBC Arabic?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask you a question that I've put to yesterday's panel, which consisted of the permanent Undersecretary to the FCDO and earlier to our panel of experts, specifically on the cuts to the BBC radio in Arabic. Last month, I've got an extract of a speech here from the current Director General of the BBC, and he said that as a result of the cuts, propaganda is going unchallenged and that the world faces an all-out assault on the truth. And the example I've put forward is where in Lebanon, Russian-backed media transmit on a radio frequency previously used by BBC Arabic, where they're now hearing unchallenged propaganda, just like we've heard from you, Baroness. Mr. Angus, as the former director of BBC World Service, I'm really keen to hear, how are these operational decisions made on which services to close down? And does the BBC set out to government the impact of these cuts?
So, I mean, I would say that the cuts to BBC Arabic radio and BBC Persian radio, which was also closed in, I think, in the same round of savings, have been extremely regrettable, and they are counterproductive. I think, to be fair to my former colleagues, nobody closed them because they don't like radio or don't believe in its value. These savings decisions were taken because, in a very difficult funding climate, the World Service was forced to choose between, where to place its future bets. And I think that question of digital transformation looking to the future tends to militate against radio, which is clearly the primary platform of a much older generation and in steep decline in many parts of the world. But having said that, I believe that it was a very, very cheap distribution at the price, and the savings that have been made both in the staff who were producing Arabic and Persian radio and in the quite significant costs of distribution were, false value, if you like, because for those radio services and for existing services, obviously the global distribution of the English radio network, but also really important services, Dr. Westcott talked about BBC Hausa, for example, which still has a really significant audience in West Africa on shortwave radio. The preservation of those audiences while they are still there always feels like good value to me. And so I think you quite rightly give examples of where no sooner were the decisions taken to close those services than immediately you have October 7th, the conflict in Gaza, you had the situation in Sudan, very, very, very important for the Arabic radio audience. Now, the BBC were wisely and should be given credit for spinning up kind of emergency stopgap services for Sudan, I think Gaza. And great, but it probably would have been better if they hadn't been cut in the first place. You just have to understand that in the Arab-speaking world, there are millions of car radios tuned to that medium wave frequency, and people just turn the radio on and they'll listen to whatever's on the frequency, and they're now getting, in some cases, Russian information on that frequency, and that's not a good outcome for anyone.
Yeah, cool.
Brief follow-up. Thank you for that answer. Did you or does the BBC have any chance to make representations to the government on the impact of those cuts as you've set up?
I mean, I think it's an important part of the BBC's operational independence that it is given an agreed funding envelope, and then decides what its recommendations are to preserve or close services. And I don't wish to argue that the World Service should be preserved in aspic and should never close, for example, radio services. I think, as I've indicated, there are good reasons around digital transformation why that would need to happen over time. I suspect, as part of the BBC's relationship with the FCDO under the Charter, the BBC would have shared its audience impact assessments of what would happen. But you mentioned service closures, and this is a good example of how, you know, the radio services closed, but of course BBC Arabic television, BBC Persian television, and their associated digital services, you know, continue. And I think there's quite a lot of focus in the existing relationship about service closures and preventing service closures. But I think that what's happened with the radio services show you can take a big chunk out of an audience without actually closing the overall language service. And I think there should be more focus on the overall audience experience and less focus on kind of trying to avoid any individual language closure.
Before we move to Abson, can I just ask you a question? This is something which I've often been told, that Al Jazeera wouldn't exist if the BBC hadn't sacked or hadn't made redundant the Arabic staff who then went off to work for Al Jazeera. That's a story that does the rounds, is that right?
Yeah, that's a kind of a longer story than slightly than we have space for the committee. But I think, to be fair to all sides, it's true that the BBC did try to open an Arabic television, or did in fact open an Arabic television service, a generation before the 2008 service launch, which is the one that exists today. And for all kinds of complicated political reasons to do with the politics of the region rather than the politics of the UK, that service was not sustainable and closed. And it is certainly true that many of the people involved in that launch went on to work for Al Jazeera. And I think, you know, the Al Jazeera experience, both in English and in Arabic, has been successful on its own terms. You can't take that away from what they've done, I think.
Sorry, I'll be very brief. It was just a quick question in relation to the news service that's transmitted through normal mainstream channels in relation to BBC Arabia. What are your views? You're the director of Al Arabiya, the chief.
I've been the chief operating officer.
Yeah. So, what are your views in terms of how other media channels in the Middle East, in particular, are viewed more positively in relation to the articulation of news, specifically in relation to the Middle East, and how people might tune into just sort of anything that's related to the conflict, the politics of the Middle East will be obtained from a channel that they perhaps might perceive as more trusting rather than Western media channels, and then they might switch on to BBC News World Service for other things that are more global. Do you think that that's a thing that people would probably perhaps trust Al Jazeera in that region, or Middle Eastern Eye, or whichever news channels there are, just because of how the news media might be received and the politics behind that?
Yeah, there's two things I'd say. The first would be that the Arabic news audience is incredibly sophisticated in terms of media literacy. I think it's unlike any other region, actually, that people have a really well-developed sense, even if they don't quite articulate it, of which provider is bringing which set of kind of assumptions and values. And I think you really see that around the coverage of the Gaza situation, the Israel-Lebanon conflict now. People will pick and choose between providers, and they'll kind of know what the source is that they're getting, and they'll understand the assumptions behind it, but they'll kind of graze amongst multiple different providers, including BBC Arabic. And I think there is a sense that when there are hyper-contested issues in the region, BBC Arabic does well, because audiences will say, well, you know, I'm going to go to something that I perceive to be a neutral and disinterested source. I think the second thing I'd say, which your question touched on really, is that, and this is relevant to our discussion of radio, you know, the demographics in the Middle East are extraordinary. You have very young populations growing, and in particular in these conflict-affected areas, including Palestine, Gaza, and other countries in the region. You have a very, very young audience who are they're certainly never going to go to radio. They may never actually go to linear television. They're all using smartphones. They're getting almost all of their news on social media. And as the previous witnesses explained, that is a threat and an opportunity. It's an opportunity because it reduces to zero your costs of distribution, but it introduces you into this kind of crazy environment of, you know, you're just one post in a feed alongside thousands of others on a platform you don't own and operate. So the BBC's right to play in that space, but I think it'd be, when we're talking about digital transformation and reinvestment and so on, it's really important. This is a really good example of, like, you have to get in there and play in that space in order to reach those younger audiences who may never go to those linear services, which when we talk about the World Service, that's kind of what we're thinking about. We're thinking about BBC World News and the World Service Radio and these kinds of services. But increasingly, particularly in conflict areas, digital services which can be harder to block and are very, very popular with young audiences.
Claire, thank you for waiting.
Not at all. Thank you, Chair, and thank you both for your time, and this has been very insightful so far as well. Mr. Angus, you earlier shared some interesting thoughts with the committee on where you felt that government funding could be located or better located from, for example, the Cabinet Office. I wanted to touch on the funding specifically of World Service Language Services using ODA money. In your previous written evidence, which was really helpful to see as well, you previously referred to the expansion of BBC language services between 2016 and 2020 being funded by largely ODA as being welcome and appropriate. I wondered in a moment about your reflections on that in the state of the world that we now see ourselves in and the extra demands that are now there on the ODA budget in a range of ways. And yesterday, as been mentioned, we had the FCDO's Permanent Undersecretary before us, and I did ask him about the impact of the cuts that we've seen to ODA on Britain's soft power, which he felt were present and real. So wondered about your thinking in that, whether there was anything here that was shaping your feeling that perhaps this funding might be better located out of the Cabinet Office. Is that linked or is that separate?
So there's a couple of different things. Just on the FCDO and the Cabinet Office, I have no material criticism for the FCDO. They were always a supportive and helpful partner, and to be fair to them, they've always tried to come up with corners of extra funding to do interesting and significant things. I think my point is rather that when the World Service budget sits in a DEL budget, I have the terminology right, that it's in a departmental budget, the World Service can only grow at the expense of something else that the department does. And Armin may come on this, the history of how the World Service saving was originally made when it was passed to the BBC. So you end up in a sort of zero-sum game where the Foreign Office is like, OK, well, we can give you £20 million more to protect an emergency radio service, but we're going to have to make a £20 million saving in our consular budget. And so my point about the Cabinet Office is that the Cabinet Office is squarely what runs and administers the national security and mission of the UK, and broadly it doesn't run other DEL budgets, and therefore that it might be a more appropriate place for the World Service to sit alongside the parliamentary body that I'd suggested. Your wider question about ODA, if I maybe just take a minute on that. So I think I said in my evidence that there is a risk, as with commercial funding, which we'll come on to talk about maybe, there's a risk of putting the ODA cart before the audience horse, which is that the availability of ODA money ends up determining what gets funded and what doesn't. And that doesn't feel like the right outcome, that theoretically. And I think it should be said that even the World Service 2020 funding included a non-ODA element, that it funded expansion to BBC Russian and BBC Arabic and the BBC Serbian service, for example, with non-ODAble money, and the Indian languages, which, sorry, forgive me, that's wrong, for Arabic and Russian. So it's important that
the United States.
Sorry?
And the United States.
That's right, yes. So it's important that the mission is defined by what the audience need is, not what the ODA rules happen to be. And I sort of said it again in my evidence that, like, if India becomes wealthy enough that it's not ODAble anymore, there's suddenly you have a huge hole in the BBC's ODA budget for the Indian language services, which is like, so that sort of shows the potential pitfalls of ODA funding. I mean, it's worth reflecting that when I was, almost when we were going into COVID, I think in 2020, we were still thinking in terms of ODA was going to sort of an endlessly rising tide, that GDP growth would continue. The ODA rules were enshrined in legislation. For the BBC to look for additional funding for the World Service, that was always the natural place to look. 18 months later, the ODA commitment had been abandoned, and now over the last couple of years, a huge amount of it's being spent on refugee activity in the UK, for example. So ODA now no longer looks like the safe haven that it used to, and I think it's good if there's realism in this committee and in the government departments and in the BBC about that. I think that's welcome.
So would you say that there is sense then in sort of uncoupling these. So you've got different sources, different ambitions to some extent, because we were looking yesterday at the sort of the FCDO's intended outcomes. Now, granted, those were formed by the last government, rather than this one, and the work to reshape those is being done at the moment. But there was something in that I thought was quite interesting about just the burden that the ODA as a budget was holding in terms of, as you say, sort of the humanitarian crisis, as well as sustainable development, as well as World Service language services. It feels incredibly broad. So would you say, as a principle, that there is now a sense in the world we find ourselves in to move these objectives and funding streams aside to protect them as far as possible?
In an ideal world, I think the mission should be funding stream agnostic, right? We should agree what the mission is, and then we should work out what sensible ways of funding it. And my only caveat was that if you put the ODA first, then you end up with a distorted set of services, perhaps.
Before Baroness Helic goes, I just wondered if there was anything else that you wanted to add. And the same goes to you as we said to the previous panel, which is if we've missed anything, if there's anything additional that you'd like to say, please write to us.
Thank you for that. No, I fully second what Jamie has said. BBC World Service is an amazing tool in the toolbox that we have of things that we can do. We don't have to do them. It is enormously important in terms of not only represented the United Kingdom, but also in terms of trying to make sense out of a very chaotic world that we live in. It cannot be done on ad hoc basis. It cannot be a transfusion when it is in a coma. It has to be constant funding that can enable BBC to compete with other services around the world, because it's not only about cutting a particular language service, it's preparing for the next stage of delivering news and delivering information. And Jamie has spoken about young population, not only in the Middle East, but I would say in Africa and Asia. And if we want to be able to compete with others who are investing billions in, we got to make sure that BBC World Service and BBC in general doesn't only rely on its brand, but it relies on solid basis, so that those who need to prepare BBC for the next 10 years have that basis. They don't have to always think, what is it that I have to give up in order to catch up with our competitors? Because I think it's almost irresponsible in the era that we live in. And I think doing it in any other way, but sustained with a lot of trust and support for BBC World Service, I think would be damaging not only to our interests abroad, but at home as well. Sorry, I have to leave. I've got a board meeting. So.
I've been so pleased that you've been able to come. I really
Thank you
have.
so much.
Thank you. I want to, because you've been referring to, we will come on to commercialisation. We will come on to digital platforms. So I'll ask you about that. Are there unintended consequences of investing as heavily as the BBC has in digital platforms in North America? And has that come at the expense of other, the Arab world and Africa and India? I think really what I'm saying is the BBC in danger of over-reporting in the US? Or is it that actually we're quite relaxed about that, given how fraught the media environment is, and that perhaps the BBC falls into a middle ground that's actually furthers Britain's interests?
So it's a complicated picture. So I'd start off by saying that Tim and the leadership team in the BBC are doing exactly the right thing in trying to heavily commercialise in North America, both in non-news, things like BritBox, and for the emerging kind of what will become the kind of North America subscription BBC News product that people will actually pay to access directly. That is a good thing. It's covered in the Charter, it's permitted commercial activity, it broadly commercialises what already exists. It's a really welcome way of supporting the licence fee and bringing those additional revenues back, and growing the audience in North America, of course, which is, I think, one of the BBC's top one or two. India and North America tend to leapfrog each other as the largest country audience. My point that I made in the written evidence was around the kind of law of unintended consequences, which is that in North America, if you make additional investments in editorial posts, in principle, you can make enough commercial money back to fund those posts and produce a profit. And that is why there is this very welcome investment into additional digital reporting roles, in particular in North America, to build out a subscription product that people in the wealthiest news market on the planet will pay for. The unintended consequences of that is if that happens alongside a drawing down and a reduction in editorial posts in places like East and West Africa, in India, in other parts of Asia, you end up with an unbalanced daily report. So, and this, you do see this sometimes when you look at the BBC News website or use the BBC News app, which I do pretty heavily, where you see a lot of commercially funded North America content, which is good quality and, no complaints about it. But if you have, a series of film reviews and in-depth digital reporting of North American politics, and it's either squeezing out from the editorial front page, or that the content just isn't there because the BBC has closed editorial roles in China, for example, you end up with a skewed perception of what is happening in the world. And that, the kind of international news website front page in the app is an incredibly important sort of snapshot picture of what the BBC thinks is important on any given day. So I'm trying to make a fairly nuanced criticism around it's good to have those commercially funded posts, but we need to absolutely make sure that we're not withdrawing from China, reporting climate change, reporting the Middle East, East and West Africa. There has to be a balance there.
You also said India, and I think that's really interesting, because if that's right, the second biggest audience being India, and if India at the moment, presumably there's the easier funding stream, which is the ODA funding for India. So what happens if India doesn't qualify any longer for ODA funding? Where are we going to get the where's the gap going to be filled when it comes to
exactly? It has to be filled by non-ODA government funding, it seems to me, because the commercialisation, it is possible to commercialise in India, and the BBC is incredibly popular in India. Actually, the investment in new Indian language services, there were 4 new Indian language services introduced after 2016. They have been enormously successful and complement BBC Hindi and then the 4 other vernacular languages. It's been a huge success story of the last 10 years, and really important to entrench that success and continue to build on it. But we have to be realistic that I don't see commercialisation of the BBC services in India as a particularly realistic way because of raising money, because not only is just commercialisation of news in general is like a really tough business, but the BBC is in a difficult political position in India right now. It's had to restructure itself after very, very extensive pressure from the Modi government in response to unwelcome reporting of Modi himself. The idea that Indian advertisers will flock to support BBC News coverage of India, that's not going to happen. It's not that kind of market.
I don't know what that means. What do you mean the BBC had to restructure itself?
So the BBC, the Indian government compelled international broadcasters, including the BBC, to sorry, they compelled them to restructure in India in order to have a locally owned subsidiary that had Indian nationals as directors in order for them to be able to publish digital news in India. And that happened, I think, this year in 2024. And it's been a difficult and unpleasant experience for the BBC to
I didn't know about
find
that.
find a way of constituting itself in India to allow itself to continue to function effectively as a digital news publisher.
Wow.
And India, the BBC is shut out of the television news market and the radio news market. It cannot easily access. It can't do any news radio at all, and it's very constrained in television. And then, as a digital news publisher, the Indian government introduced an onerous series of regulations and launched a tax raid on the BBC bureau to, arguably to punish it for its unhelpful coverage of Modi and his government.
Nevertheless, it's the World Service's second biggest audience.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. Well done.
Thank you, Chair. Just to come in on that, because that has been really interesting to hear about. Would you say that the World Service in India has been able to retain its independence despite that, because of the fact that it has restructured because of the preferences of the Indian government?
I'm sure it has, and I've not seen anything in the coverage that's caused me alarm. And the BBC continues to report robustly on India. And when you see BBC execs, you can ask them this question. I mean, this postdates my time there, but I think it's concerning because it reflects the direction India is going in, which seems to me, which is becoming a less and less tolerant climate of press freedom in India, even though it's a country with an amazing journalism tradition.
Very good. We have a few questions that I think I want John to ask, which is about funding and the funding model for the World Service, given his expertise.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I mean, as we've discussed, funding of the World Service has sort of flip-flopped from government, licence fee payer, etc. And each has advantages and disadvantages, as the previous witnesses were setting out. Now, you, I understand, put forward a suggestion, which I think Michael Grade first sort of advanced, of the idea of splitting the English language services, which might continue to be paid for by the licence fee, and then the overseas language services, which would be funded by grant and aid. So I wanted to explore, first of all, how realistic it is to divide them in that way, because I think there is some overlap between the two. And secondly, I wanted you to say a bit more about your suggestion, which I suspect may not go down too well at the Treasury, which is that Parliament should have a say of the funding as well as the government.
So I think my if I could wave my magic wand, my wish would be that they would be operationally embedded, continue to be unified and embedded in the BBC and produced by the BBC, but there was just a separate funding stream. And I think splitting off the World Service back to its pre-2010 model, where it actually was almost a separate organisation from the rest of the BBC, actually certainly a separate organisation from the rest of BBC News, is not a good idea. I think the benefits overall to the BBC and to the World Service.
We don't recreate Bush House.
We don't. Well, we might wish to recreate Bush House in some ways, but I think the sort of the separate World Service empire with its own board and a very a non-integrated structure would not be welcome, just because of the huge progress that's been made in the last 15 years of making the World Service a part of BBC News. So I suppose I would say it continue to be an integrated production model, but the funding mechanisms would be discrete between English, which there are good reasons for it to be funded by the BBC, and the language services, which equally good reasons why the government should probably pick up the tab for. I mean, I think the question about kind of parliamentary oversight reflects partly my feeling that when I was there, I didn't really feel that the BBC board had the bandwidth to really scrutinise and assess what the World Service did, if I'm completely honest. I think the BBC board is so pulled in so many different directions that it doesn't have the headspace to really scrutinise and think about the strategic future of the World Service in the way that it might and arguably should. And I think a parliamentary structure that involved parliamentarians both in setting and protecting the funding and alongside the board in the oversight and scrutiny of things like, distribution strategy, the editorial content, that would be welcome, because it would co-opt the great love and support the parliamentarians feel for the institution into kind of effective scrutineering work alongside having a role in protecting setting and protecting the funding. But I agree with your remarks about the Treasury.
And is there not a slight risk that might be seen to be politicising the management of the World Service?
Possibly, and as I said to Mr. McDougall, I think there's no perfect answer to this. I think there's no structure that prevents anyone who wants to have a pop at the World Service for being not being independent enough from doing that anyway. I think the reason that I suggested it was that I just felt my time as director, the time I spent talking to parliamentarians about the World Service, I was very, very struck by the depth and cross-party nature of that support, and it doesn't feel a way currently that can translate into actually helping to set and protect the budgets. Not that the work of this committee is not very welcome, it is very welcome. But how do you actually create a structure that allows parliaments to take a greater role both in the oversight and in setting and protecting the funding? That was my ambition.
Yeah, I mean, I think that argument applies across the BBC's services. I mean, people feel very strongly about other things the BBC do. I mean, local radio, for instance, if you asked Parliament, the BBC would not have made any cuts to local radio. But anyway, it's certainly an interesting suggestion which we will take account of. So thank you.
Thank you, Sir John.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time this afternoon. We really appreciate it. As I said to earlier witnesses, if there's anything additional that you think that we didn't ask or you weren't given an opportunity to speak about, then please do write to us, and we may be in touch in any event to try and clarify some things. The Culture, Media and Sport Committee has also been taking evidence today about the BBC World Service, and we hope to be working with them, taking evidence from ministers in December.
Lovely.
So thank you very much. Order.